The words hit like cold wind through falling autumn leaves. "Pack your tools, Garrett, you're done." 50 mechanics froze mid-shift as Marcus Garrett stood beneath the rust-colored maple trees lining the docks of Harbor Ridge Marine Yard in Portland, Maine. He didn't argue, didn't beg, just removed the photograph of his 2 children from his locker and walked out while golden leaves skittered across the concrete. 28 minutes later, sirens wailed. 2 Navy Blackhawks sliced through the crisp October sky, rotor wash scattering leaves in a storm of red and gold. And a commander stepped onto the dock asking one question: "Where is Chief Petty Officer Marcus Garrett?" The morning had started like every other Tuesday in late October. Fog off Casco Bay pressing against the yard's floodlights, the smell of salt water and machine oil, and the steady percussion of tools against steel. Harbor Ridge Marine Yard stretched along the southern edge of Portland Harbor. 63 mechanics working 3 rotating shifts to keep the New England fishing fleet and a handful of commercial vessels seaworthy. Marcus Garrett had been here 16 years. He knew every vessel by sound, the particular knock of the Harrington trawler's port engine, the way the Lady Constance creaked when her bilge pump ran dry, the subtle vibration that told him when a propeller shaft bearing was about to fail. He'd learned it the way his father had taught him, through hands and ears, not spreadsheets. He was 40 years old, and he had been head mechanic for 7 of those 16 years, not because he'd campaigned for the title, but because everyone in the yard understood that Marcus Garrett was the one you called when something was genuinely wrong. Courtney Aldridge had been yard manager for 11 weeks. She arrived that morning in pressed khakis and a fleece vest with the corporate logo of Coastal Maritime Solutions embossed above her heart, the holding company that had quietly acquired Harbor Ridge 6 months ago. Aldridge was 38, held an MBA from a university in Boston, and had spent the previous 4 years managing supply chain operations for a regional grocery distributor. What she had now was a mandate: reduce labor costs by 20% before the fiscal year closed in December. She found Marcus on slip 14, crouched beneath a 60-foot lobster boat named the Alice Margaret, running his fingers along a hairline crack in the keel reinforcement that no one else had caught on the initial survey. Garrett. Marcus didn't look up immediately. He pressed his palm flat against the hull, feeling the vibration of water on the other side. Then he straightened, wiped grease from his hands with a red rag, and turned. "What is it?" "Team metrics." Aldridge held a printed report. "Your throughput is 40% below the yard average. You completed 2 vessel inspections this week. Peterson completed 7. Peterson completed 7 visual walkthroughs. I completed 2 full structural assessments. The Alice Margaret has a keel crack that would have let her take on water before she reached 10 miles offshore. You want me to walk past that so my numbers look better?" Aldridge's expression didn't shift. This, Marcus realized, was the tell the woman wasn't wrong or right. She simply didn't have enough framework to evaluate the difference. "You've been warned twice about productivity benchmarks. The company has a performance standard. The company has a liability standard too, when boats sink because inspectors were chasing throughput numbers." The yard had gone quiet. Every mechanic within earshot had stopped what he was doing. Danny Reyes, 26, 3 years on the job. Marcus had trained him from his first week, stood near the toolboxes with a socket wrench loose in his hand, watching. "Effective immediately, your employment is terminated for failure to meet performance standards." Aldridge held out a folded paper. "HR will process your final paycheck. Security will escort you from the premises." Marcus looked at the termination notice for a long moment without taking it. He looked at Danny, who met his eyes and then glanced away. He looked at the other mechanics, men and women he'd worked beside for years, and saw in their faces not cruelty but the specific guilt of people who need their jobs and have families and cannot afford the cost of standing up. He understood that completely. He took the paper. At his locker, he took down the photograph taped to the inside of the door. His daughter Sophie, 14, and his son Caleb, 11, standing at the rail of a ferry boat on a summer trip to Peaks Island. They were squinting into the sun and laughing. He folded the photo and put it in his shirt pocket. He walked out through the yard gates while golden leaves blew across the concrete in small spiraling eddies. Behind him, the 50 mechanics of Harbor Ridge Marine Yard stood in silence, and the Alice Margaret sat on her blocks with a crack in her keel that only one man in the yard had known to find. Marcus drove a 2009 Ford F-150 that had belonged to his father, Thomas Garrett, who had died of a cardiac event at 62 while rebuilding the transmission of a neighbor's tractor. The truck had 214,000 miles on it and ran without complaint. Marcus serviced it himself in the driveway every 4 months. He drove north along the harbor road without deciding where to go, and found himself parking in front of a coffee shop on Maritime Avenue called the Anchor and Cup. It was the kind of place that had been there for 30 years and hadn't changed its sign or its counter stools, and the woman behind the bar, Ruth, 60s, white hair pinned up, refilled his mug without being asked. "Bad morning?" she said. "Apparently I'm not efficient enough." She made a sound that was not quite a laugh. The efficient ones always look busy and never fix anything right. Marcus wrapped both hands around the mug and looked out the window at the harbor. The water was slate gray under the October sky. A few lobster boats heading out late, their wakes spreading wide and then flattening. He'd grown up 3 miles from here. He'd gone into the Navy at 19 because his family had no money for college, served 8 years, made chief petty officer, left when his daughter was born because the deployments made it impossible to be the father he intended to be. He'd come back to Portland and taken the mechanic's job at Harbor Ridge because it paid reasonably and it was the kind of work he could be proud of. Keeping vessels seaworthy, keeping people safe. Over the years, he'd risen to head mechanic, a role that came without fanfare, and with the unspoken understanding that the title meant he was the last line of accountability before a vessel went to sea. Sandra, his ex-wife, had called it a lack of ambition. She'd wanted him to use the Bill, get an engineering degree, move into a management track somewhere. He'd tried to explain that management wasn't what he was built for, that there was satisfaction in the physical work, in the moment a broken thing became whole. She hadn't understood it, or perhaps hadn't wanted to. She left when Caleb was 4. She lived in Phoenix now and called on birthdays. His phone buzzed. A text from Sophie. "Dad, did you remember the Philadelphia trip is next month? Hartley says we need to pay the deposit by Friday, $180. He put the phone face down on the counter and looked at the harbor again. In the bed of the truck, he carried a red, metal toolbox, old enough that the paint was worn to bare metal at the corners. His father's. Inside it, laid in the original foam cutouts, were tools that Thomas Garrett had used for 40 years. A set of combination wrenches, a torque wrench calibrated by hand, a brass-handled screwdriver worn smooth where the palm had gripped it 10,000 times. Marcus had never worked a job without that toolbox in the truck. He picked up his phone and texted back, "I'll have it. We'll be fine." He did not yet know how true that statement would turn out to be. At 10:02 a.m., a United States Navy vessel designated USS Meridian, a Cyclone-class patrol coastal ship assigned to naval exercises in the Gulf of Maine, developed a propulsion fault 11 nautical miles off Portland Head Light. The fault was not minor. A malfunction in the integrated propulsion control system had triggered a cascading lock across all drive outputs, leaving the ship without maneuvering capability. She was still afloat, still powered, but unable to make way. In deteriorating October seas with wind coming out of the northeast, drifting was not an option. Commander Nathaniel Brooks, 52, 29 years in the United States Navy, had her towed to the nearest available commercial marine facility with an emergency berth Harbor Ridge. The facility pier supervisor, a man named Frank Holloway, met them at the dock. He was already on the phone with Aldridge when the Meridian was being tied off. "What are we dealing with?" Brooks asked, stepping onto the dock with the specific economy of motion that career naval officers develop no wasted movement No performative urgency, just the controlled efficiency of someone accustomed to real emergencies. "Propulsion control fault," said the Meridian's chief engineer, Lieutenant Commander Wesley Archer, following close behind. "The diagnostic system is throwing encrypted error codes. We've been trying to read them for 2 hours. The encryption is military standard. It requires someone with specific protocol clearance or the kind of hands-on experience to work around it manually." "What does your diagnostic equipment show?" Holloway asked. "That's the problem. Our commercial diagnostic interface can't parse the encrypted outputs. We need someone who knows how to bypass the diagnostic layer and read the system states directly, manually." Holloway went quiet. He looked at Archer, then at Brooks, then back at his clipboard. "We have a mechanic who can do that," said a voice behind him. Danny Reyes stood at the edge of the group, socket wrench still in his hand from the morning. He was young enough to look slightly uncertain about speaking in this company, but he held his ground. "His name is Marcus Garrett. He's a former chief petty officer. He's worked with these propulsion systems, and he knows how to read the diagnostics manually. He trained me on it." Brooks looked at him directly. "Where is he?" Danny hesitated. Holloway said nothing. Aldridge, who had arrived at the dock 3 minutes earlier, was standing to the left in the kind of stillness that precedes a very bad feeling. "He's not here," Danny said. "He was let go this morning." Brooks turned and looked at Aldridge with an expression that carried the entire weight of his 29 years of service. "He was terminated 2 hours ago," Aldridge said. Her voice was even. "For performance issues." Brooks took a breath through his nose. "Get him back here." Marcus was on his second cup of coffee when he heard the sound. Every person who has served in the military has a set of sounds embedded deep enough that they bypass conscious recognition sounds that go directly from ear to spine before the brain catches up. The low thudding percussion of rotor blades was one of those sounds for Marcus Garrett. He looked up from his coffee mug. Through the front window of the Anchor and Cup, beyond Maritime Avenue and the cluster of parked cars, beyond the low roofline of the harbor buildings, 2 shapes moved against the gray October sky. UA-60 Black Hawks, flying low and direct, heading for the harbor. Ruth refilled his mug. "Navy? Looks like it. Something happened out on the water. Don't know." He wrapped his hands around the warm ceramic and watched. 4 minutes later, the door of the Anchor and Cup opened. Nathaniel Brooks filled the doorway in the way that certain people fill spaces, not through physical size, though he was broad-shouldered and gray at the temples, but through the specific gravity of someone accustomed to being responsible for things that matter. He wore his service uniform, and he looked around the coffee shop until his eyes landed on Marcus. He crossed the room and stopped at the stool beside him. "Chief Garrett." Marcus looked at him for a long moment. He set down the mug. "That was another life, Commander." "I know. I need it to be this one for about 3 hours." Brooks pulled out the stool beside him and sat. "USS Meridian. Propulsion control fault, encrypted diagnostics, and a 2-knot drift in northeast swells. I've got a ship with no maneuvering capability, a lieutenant commander who is excellent at his job and cannot parse the encrypted fault codes, and I was told that you are the one person in Portland Harbor who can." Marcus looked out the window. The Black Hawks had set down somewhere near the yard. He could see a faint cloud of disturbed leaves drifting over the rooftops. "Who told you that?" "A young mechanic named Reyes." He seemed quite certain. Marcus was quiet for a moment. He thought about the Alice, Margaret, and her keel crack. He thought about the photo in his shirt pocket. He thought about his father's toolbox in the bed of the truck. "There are conditions," he said. Brooks nodded once. "I expected that. Let's hear them." They sat at the counter of the Anchor and Cup for 11 minutes, and by the end of it, the terms were set. Marcus would return to the yard as an independent contractor, not an employee. Not reinstated, not rehired. A private professional engaged for a single specific task, compensated at a consulting rate he named without hesitation. Brooks accepted without negotiation. Full technical authority on the repair. No one tells me how to do the work or sets a time benchmark. If I need to take 4 hours, I take 4 hours. Agreed. Archer briefs me privately before I board. I need the full diagnostic history without any editing for command optics. You'll have it. Marcus picked up his coffee, finished it, and set the mug down on the counter with a quiet click. One more thing. 5 minutes alone with Aldridge before I start. In her office. No one present. Brooks studied him. I can arrange that. I won't ask what it's about. I know you won't. That's why I'm telling you. Ruth, who had been wiping down the counter at the far end and pretending not to listen, caught Marcus's eye and gave him a nod so small it was almost invisible. Marcus left a 20 on the counter, twice the price of the coffee, and followed Brooks out the door. They walked to the F-150, and Marcus lifted his father's toolbox from the bed, carrying it by the handle. Brooks watched this without comment. They drove the 4 blocks to Harbor Ridge in convoy truck. 2 naval sedans, and when the gates swung open, 50 mechanics stood in the yard, and the thing in their faces now was different from the thing Marcus had seen there 2 hours ago. He set the toolbox down on the dock and looked at the Meridian, riding at berth, quiet and gray and waiting. Then he turned toward the yard office, and the yard parted to let him through. The 5 minutes with Aldridge happened behind a closed door, and only the 2 of them knew exactly what was said. What the mechanics outside could observe was that Courtney Aldridge went into her office walking with the stride of a woman who still believed she held authority, and came out 8 minutes later, 3 minutes over the agreed 5 walking differently. Marcus emerged expressionless and went directly to the Meridian. Lieutenant Commander Wesley Archer was waiting at the gangway. He was 38, precise in his movements, and he had the careful manner of a technically excellent officer who had spent the last 2 hours watching a problem exceed his capabilities. He handed Marcus a printed diagnostic report without preamble. Marcus read it walking. He read it the way certain people read technical documents not left to right, word by word, but in a kind of scanning pattern that pulled out the relevant data before the eyes had consciously finished the page. "Digital choke loop," he said. "That's what we suspected," Archer said. "But the encrypted output is generating a false lockout signal that your diagnostic interface is reading as a hardware fault." "It's not. The hardware is fine. The control module thinks it's in a failure state that it's not actually in, and it's refusing to release the drives." Marcus stopped at the hatch to the engine room. "Do you have a manual bypass rig?" "We have the components. I need them assembled before we go in. And I need someone to watch the primary console. Not to do anything, just watch, and call out the status indicators every 15 seconds. Archer had his people assembled in 4 minutes. They were good. Marcus registered this the way he registered everything mechanical, with a specific and impersonal appreciation. These were competent professionals who had encountered a problem outside the edge of their training. That was not a failure of character. The engine room of a Cyclone-class ship is not a large space. It smells of diesel fuel and hot metal and the specific electrical smell of active systems under load. The light is harsh and angled. Every surface is painted in naval gray. Marcus set his father's toolbox on the deck plates, opened it, and began to work. The digital choke loop was, at its core, an elegant failure mode. The propulsion control system had encountered an unexpected state transition and had recursively locked itself, trying to resolve the error. It was like a key that had jammed in a lock while turning. The solution was not to force it and not to replace it, but to understand the specific geometry of the jam and apply the precise counter-movement that released it. He built the manual bypass rig by hand, using components from Archer's kit and 2 specific tools from his father's box, the calibrated torque wrench and a brass-handled screwdriver that had turned 10,000 bolts before he was born. "Status," he said, read across the board, called Petty Officer Sandra Whitmore from the console. "Drive outputs locked, control module in fault state, secondary watchdog showing active." "Good. When I say go, you're going to see the watchdog go dark for approximately 90 seconds. That's intentional. If it goes dark and stays dark past 90 seconds, Call it out immediately." "Understood." Outside on the dock, Commander Brooks stood with his hands clasped behind his back, watching the open hatch. Next to him, Danny Reyes stood very still. Behind them, the 50 mechanics of Harbor Ridge Marine Yard had quietly gathered. The October wind moved through the yard, carrying leaves. Inside the engine room, Marcus Garrett held the bypass rig in his left hand and the brass-handled screwdriver in his right, and he was absolutely still for a count of 3, not hesitating, but listening, the way his father had taught him to listen before he turned a wrench. "Go." The watchdog light went dark. Archer's team watched the console in silence. Whitmore called the seconds. The secondary indicators red, sat unchanged. 45 seconds. Red. 60 seconds. Red. 72 seconds. Still red. Marcus made a single, fractional adjustment. His jaw was set and his eyes were focused on a point somewhere past the console, the way a surgeon's eyes go past the incision to the thing underneath. 83 seconds. The leftmost indicator changed. Amber. Then, the next one. Amber. Amber. Then, in a cascade left to right across the console, 6 indicators flipped from red to green in the space of 4 seconds. "Green board," Whitmore said, and her voice was the voice of someone who had been holding a breath for 90 seconds. All drive outputs released. Control module nominal. Secondary watchdog active. Marcus set down the tools. He looked at the board for a long moment. "Run the propulsion test cycle. Full rotation, both shafts, 10% power." The Meridian shivered beneath their feet as her propellers turned. Archer looked at the readings. He looked at Marcus. "It's not just restored. The efficiency coefficient is better than it was before the fault." Marcus picked up the brass-handled screwdriver and put it back in the foam cutout in his father's box. "It was running slightly out of calibration before. I adjusted it while I was in there." He closed the lid of the toolbox. Outside, on the dock in the cold October air, Commander Nathaniel Brooks heard the propellers begin to turn and allowed himself one quiet exhale. When Marcus came up through the hatch and onto the dock, carrying his father's toolbox, Brooks extended his hand. They shook without ceremony. "An hour and 14 minutes, Brooks said. "From the time your boots hit the deck, the rig assembly took longer than it needed to. Archer's team will know it for next time." Courtney Aldridge was standing at the edge of the dock area. She had found, in the intervening time, a kind of poise, the expression of a woman who has decided to frame a disaster as a lesson she was always part of. She stepped forward as Marcus came down the gangway. "Garrett, I want you to know that what you did today..." Marcus stopped walking. He looked at Aldridge, and the yard was quiet enough that what he said next reached every mechanic standing in it. "You don't know the difference between value and cost. You looked at my throughput numbers and saw a problem. You should have looked at what my throughput numbers were protecting. Every time I spent 4 hours on one vessel, I was preventing the kind of failure that grounds a ship, opens a company to liability, or," he paused, "prevents a naval vessel from making way in northeast swells." He picked up the toolbox. "I don't work for Harbor Ridge. I worked for Harbor Ridge. I'm a contractor now, and you don't have a contract with me." He walked north along the dock, between the 2 rows of mechanics who had stood watching all morning, and they stepped back on both sides to give him room, not in deference, but the way people step back when a fact moves through a space and changes everything in it. Overhead, the 2 Black Hawks lifted from their landing positions at the north end of the yard, banked east over the harbor, and flew a single circuit over the October water before turning south toward the Naval Air Station. Danny Reyes watched them go, then looked down at the socket wrench still in his hand. He put it back on the rack. Then he went to find the Alice Margaret and checked the keel crack, and properly documented it in the inspection log. A bystander on the dock, a commercial fisherman named Gary Hewson, waiting for a survey on his boat, had filmed 45 seconds of the Black Hawk landing and Marcus Garrett walking to the anchor and cup with Commander Brooks. He sent it to a friend without context under the subject line, Navy sent helicopters for the mechanic they fired this morning and went back to reading his newspaper. By that evening, the footage had reached 4 million people. By the following morning, a maritime industry reporter named Caroline Strickland had tracked down 3 separate sources at Harbor Ridge, confirmed the identity of the vessel, and published a piece that was careful, factually precise, and devastating in the way that careful, factually precise things sometimes are. The piece documented Marcus's 16 years at the yard, Aldridge's 11 weeks, the termination, the timeline, the Navy's emergency retrieval, and the result. The Maritime Labor Board opened a review of Harbor Ridge's termination procedures within 72 hours of the story's publication. Coastal Maritime Solutions Communications Department released a statement expressing confidence in the yard's management and commitment to employee well-being. The statement generated a secondary round of coverage that was worse than the original. Courtney Aldridge was placed on administrative leave pending the review. Her professional profile, which had featured a quote about optimizing human capital, was quietly set to private. The company's parent firm stock declined 4.2% over 3 trading days. The decline was attributed by analysts to operational credibility concerns in a core business segment, which was a careful way of saying that the world had seen what happened when you optimized the mechanic who keeps the ships from sinking. Marcus, during all of this, was unreachable for comment. He had taken Sophie and Caleb to Peaks Island for 2 days, staying at a bed and breakfast they'd gone to once when the kids were small. They ate chowder at a restaurant overlooking the water and walked the island's north shore in the afternoon with the wind in their faces. Caleb collected rocks. Sophie took photographs with the old camera Marcus had found at a garage sale and fixed up for her 14th birthday. On the second evening, a federal contracting officer called his cell phone and offered him a position as a 2-4-hour on-call technical consultant for naval propulsion systems in the northeastern United States. The rate was 4 times what Harbor Ridge had paid him. The commitment was immediate availability. Any hour, any day. Marcus looked out at the water from the bed and breakfast porch. Sophie was reading on the porch swing. Caleb was inside building something with the blocks Marcus had brought in his bag. "I have children who need regular hours," he said. The contracting officer made several alternative proposals, each one slightly more flexible than the last. Marcus listened to all of them with courtesy and declined all of them with the same quiet clarity. He ended the call, put the phone in his pocket, and sat down in the porch chair. "Who was that?" Sophie asked, not looking up from her book. "Somebody offering me a job. Are you going to take it?" "No." She turned a page. "Good. You always said no. Good job asks you to be away all the time." Marcus looked at her. This 14-year-old who had inherited her grandmother's gray eyes and his own habit of getting straight to the point, and felt something settle in his chest, like a weight finding its proper place. "Yeah," he said. "I did say that." The regional director of Coastal Maritime Solutions was a man named Philip Garand, 57, who had been in the maritime industry for 30 years and was, unlike Aldridge, entirely aware of the difference between efficiency metrics and structural integrity. He had watched the previous week's events from an office in Boston, with the specific kind of controlled dismay that comes from watching a problem you could have prevented and didn't. He drove to Portland himself. He did not send an intermediary. He met Marcus at the Anchor and Cup at this point, the most consequential coffee shop in the Portland maritime industry, on a Tuesday morning 2 weeks after the Meridian incident. He came without lawyers, without a prepared statement, and without a counter-proposal in his back pocket. He came with the posture of a man who understood he needed to listen before he spoke. Marcus arrived 6 minutes late, not as a power move, but because Caleb had needed help finding his left shoe before the school bus came. He sat down, declined coffee because he'd already had 2 cups, and said, "Here's what I need." What he described was not re-employment. It was a structural arrangement, independent contractor status, retained at a monthly rate regardless of whether he was called out, with separate emergency rates for after-hours work. full technical authority on any task he accepted, no interference in methodology, no throughput benchmarks applied to his work. The second element was not about him at all. I want a formal apprenticeship program. 4 positions, paid. I select the candidates. Curriculum is mine to design. The goal is to develop mechanics who understand safety and structural assessment, not just throughput, and the program has a 5-year commitment, meaning the company can't cut it when the next quarterly review comes around. Garand wrote this down. Third, mandatory safety audit of all active vessels in the yard, conducted by an independent marine surveyor before the yard returns to full operations. Whatever comes out of that audit gets fixed before it's deferred. Garand looked at that point for a moment. That's expensive. The alternative is more expensive. Caroline Strickland is still reporting on this story, and she is very good at her job. Garand almost smiled. Almost. The audit will happen, he said. The contract was signed that Thursday. Danny Reyes was the first name on Marcus's apprenticeship list. He'd called him the night before and offered him the slot, and Danny had said yes before Marcus had finished the sentence. The first apprenticeship session started the following Monday at 6 a.m. It was still October. The sun was barely up when 4 young mechanics stood on the dock with Marcus Garrett, and he handed each of them a printed document. Not a checklist, but a set of principles. At the top it read, "The purpose of this work is not speed. The purpose of this work is that no one comes home less whole than when they left." Danny read it twice. Then he folded it and put it in his breast pocket. April in Portland comes in the manner of something that has been waiting at some distance and finally decides to arrive cold still in the mornings. But with a brightness in the light that October doesn't have, the quality of a beginning rather than an ending. Harbor Ridge Marine Yard had changed in ways that metrics captured poorly. Repair completion rates were up 12%. Rework rates, the percentage of jobs that required a second intervention, were down 61%. Insurance claims had dropped. Vessel downtime had dropped. The independent safety audit had identified 31 items across the active fleet. 29 had been corrected in the first 2 months. The remaining 2 were under repair. The audit had also identified the Alice Margaret's keel crack properly documented now in Danny Reyes's inspection log, and the vessel had been correctly repaired over the course of a week in February. Her owner, a third-generation lobsterman named Robert Kittredge, had driven to the yard when the work was done and stood in the lot until he found Marcus. "They told me you found the crack in October," he said. "Before you were fired. Somebody would have caught it eventually." Kittredge shook his head slowly. "I've fished those waters for 32 years. I know what 10 miles offshore in February swells looks like if your keel goes." He held out his hand. "Thank you." Marcus shook it. Courtney Aldridge's administrative leave had become a formal separation from the company in January. The Maritime Labor Board review resulted in a consent order requiring Coastal Maritime Solutions to revise its performance evaluation criteria to include safety-oriented metrics. Aldridge was not fined and was not legally barred from the industry, but the consent order was public record, and her name appeared in it in a way that would follow any future employer who looked. Commander Brooks had called in February with an offer from the Navy's Technical Advisory Board, a remote position, 2 days a month, contributing to the development of propulsion maintenance protocols for Cyclone-class vessels. The time commitment was fixed and predictable. Marcus had accepted it. On a Thursday morning in late April, Marcus Garrett sat on the back porch of the house he rented on Hartley Street, 3 blocks from the school his kids attended, and 5 blocks from the harbor. The yard was behind him, the day not yet started, coffee going cold in the mug at his elbow. His father's toolbox sat beside the porch steps with its lid open. Inside the house, Caleb was eating cereal and arguing with Sophie about something that seemed urgent and would be forgotten by afternoon. Sophie was leaving for school in 20 minutes. She came out through the back door in her jacket, bag on one shoulder, and stopped. "Dad, can I ask you something?" "Sure, miss." Reeves assigned a personal essay. Leadership and Integrity. I want to write about you. About what happened in October. She hesitated not from uncertainty about the topic, but with the consideration of a 14-year-old who has learned that people have feelings about being written about. Is that okay? Marcus looked at her for a moment, at the gray eyes and the camera bag strap over her shoulder and the seriousness in her face that he recognized because he'd been told his whole life that he had the same kind of seriousness. Yeah, he said. That's okay. I've been thinking about what I want to say, about how you stayed yourself even when it cost you, about how you didn't argue or beg, she searched for the word, held to what you knew was right. And then you set conditions for coming back. You didn't go back on their terms, you went back on your own terms. Marcus picked up the cooling coffee and looked at the yard. Make sure you write about the Alice Margaret, he said. The keel crack. That's the actual story. Sophie pulled out her phone to make a note. Why? Because the point isn't that I walked out with my head up. The point is that the crack was there, and I found it, and it mattered that I found it. That's what this work is. Not the drama of who fires who or what helicopters show up. The work is finding the thing that will fail before it fails. Sophie looked at him for a moment with the expression of someone updating an internal document. Okay, she said, but I'm still going to write about the helicopters. Marcus almost smiled. She went inside to get Caleb, and Marcus sat with the cooling coffee and the open toolbox and the April morning coming in over the harbor and the sound of the yard beginning to wake up 3 blocks south, the particular sound of men and women who knew their work and were doing it. His father had told him once, on a Saturday afternoon in the driveway while they worked on an engine together, that a person who knew how to fix things would never be useless in the world. At 14, Marcus had heard this as practical advice. At 40, he understood it as something closer to a philosophy. That the ability to understand a broken system, to find the fault and address it precisely, was not a lesser form of intelligence, but a specific and essential one. The yard was running well. The Alice Margaret was at sea. The essay, when Sophie finished it 3 weeks later, was submitted to the state secondary school writing competition. It was titled Integrity in Practice: What My Father Taught Me About Leadership. The selection committee nominated it for the regional scholarship in persuasive writing. Sophie called him at the yard when she found out. He was under a trawler's hull at the time, and he had to climb out to take the call. And he stood in the October-turned-April sun with grease on his hands and listened to Sophie read the email aloud. That's good, he said. Dad, they might give me money for college. I know. That's what I mean. He could hear Sophie laughing on the other end of the line, and he looked up at the main sky, that particular blue of spring mornings, and then back down at the trawler waiting for him to finish his work. He climbed back under,